The Airline Business Podcast is sponsored by Panasonic Avionics. Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, airlines still aiming high despite first quarter drag. My name's Graham Dunn, Executive Editor at Flight Global, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, not bad at all, not bad at all. Nice to be back on the podcast after a few weeks off.
Great to be back.
And it's been busy, it's been a hectic period, and we'll come on to why it's been quite so hectic for us a little bit later on in the podcast, but this has been a particularly intense period for the industry. We've just had the first quarter results season where pretty much, this feels like, I don't know if there's any science to this, Lewis, but it feels to me as though this is almost the shortest period in which airline results have come out. I mean, there's been something pretty much every week for the last 5-6 weeks. I mean, obviously the downside of that is we're quite busy, but the plus side is you get a real sense for where the industry sits after this first quarter. And I don't know about you, Lewis, I think my main takeaway was that the first quarter itself wasn't fantastic, but everyone still seemed to be pretty positive.
I think that's a decent summary. Obviously, there are different stories depending on region, but yeah, exactly. I think, where we're talking from in Europe, the message was kind of, just ignore what we just said because the rest of the year is going to be fine in very broad terms certainly for more than one of the big groups. So yeah, exactly. It's nothing new that airlines don't make, certainly in the northern hemisphere don't tend to make their money in the first quarter of the year. Obviously that differs in Latin America, for example, but yes, it was kind of, you just wait and see what's coming next because you're going to be really impressed. So yeah, we'll take them at their word and see what happens, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is quite interesting. You watch many, the various companies, and they all have a sort of rationale as to why that specific quarter was difficult for them. They can all see, and some of this are really easy to pick out. I mean, Lufthansa, for example, which did have a challenging quarter. In fact, it lowered its full year earnings forecast off the back of it, but that was partly due to a lot of, well, not partly, probably primarily because of the heavy strike action which afflicted both Lufthansa itself, but also the travel sector more widely in Germany in particular. Although there was quite a lot of disruption. It's not the only airline in Europe where there was travel disruption across the wider chain. As an airline, you're affected if you have a problem at the airline itself, but you're also affected if you're strike issues at the airport or getting people to the airport. There are numerous ways they can be hit. Lufthansa was a very clear example of an airline which you could point to, a reason why they were impacted. And then I think in many cases you also had other airlines who, an issue we've talked about regularly over the past year, which is supply chain and a lack of capacity coming in. But as we've said previously, it's a real double-edged sword in terms of people not necessarily being able to grow as fast as they want, but equally it's giving everyone extra optimism for the summer in terms of yields being perhaps stronger than they might otherwise have thought.
Yeah, it sort of comes back to the predictability factor, I think, to an extent, because in Air France-KLM's case, their Q1 was heavily impacted by some parts supply challenges, so that weren't expected. So obviously, a level of that is expected, but they're worse than expected, I guess, is a better way of putting it. And they had one-off costs relating to a labour agreement with KLM as well. But yeah, you're right. There's one element to these supply chain challenges that are still continuing to support, strong yield looking across the rest of the year. But whenever there's a bit of a shock in terms of things being worse than people thought, whether that's on parts, on any kind of MRO activity, or on the deliveries of the aircraft themselves, that's continuing to prompt more than one carrier to have to revise its outlook for the year. And I think, while broadly it's fair to say there are positive impacts of this restricted capacity for the incumbents, particularly when the developments are are unexpected or much worse than expected. So, if you're expecting to get 40 aircraft this year and now you're only going to get 10, your higher costs are starting to be felt more because you don't have as much capacity to spread those costs over, particularly if you're already invested in getting in the extra pilots, the extra crew, the extra ground staff or whatever to deal with those new aircraft. So it's very much, I think, a great example of a double-edged sword. And as I say, that what's I think still most challenging is the unpredictability of it. We've all know, and we've known for some time, that capacity is restricted. But when we keep getting these new developments, and on top of what's going on with the Pratt and Whitney engines, still, of course, it's still an environment, where I was reading, Volaris, the Mexican low-cost carrier, a bit sceptical about how quickly the issues that, they'll get all of their aircraft back that are grounded by the Pratt and Whitney issue. So again, another example of that unpredictability, which is weighing on certainly on sentiment to an extent, and obviously financials to an extent as well.
Yeah, it feels like sort of the stabilisers haven't come off 100% yet, so we don't fully know what it's going to be like when everything gets back to normal, even 2-3 years since the pandemic.
Yeah, precisely. And I think, I'd probably go back, the closest we've got to seeing that might be the US sort of short-haul market, which was obviously, alongside China, certainly the domestic US market is absolutely massive. It's 10% plus of all flying in terms of capacity in a normal year. Given that was kind of one of the first out of the pandemic, I think it's interesting to see what's happening there. And there's talk of overcapacity, even amid the challenges we've talked about, certainly on certain routes. I think there's a feeling in the short-haul markets that people have kind of powered back into certain real, particularly popular leisure destinations. And, more than one carrier now is talking about having to cut back. We know that flights between the US and Latin America as well, there's a sense that there's overcapacity in that market. JetBlue, for example, which is a big player there, is again talking about rejigging its network approach because of that. So I think, like you say, the normalisation, quite frankly, we're a way off. We know that in February, I think for the first time since the pandemic, IATA's global traffic and capacity exceeded 2019 levels, with the caveat that was probably partly because it was a leap year this year, so February had an extra day. But we also know that, of course, if the industry had carried on at 3 to 4% growth during the pandemic years, on that basis, we're still way behind where we would have been. But certainly, in the US short-haul domestic market, where capacity had already tipped over 2019 levels quite some time ago, you're starting to see, I think, those normalisation effects. And obviously in the US, you also have to chuck in the reticence to allow consolidation to happen, which we've seen evidence of. And obviously we've heard, Spirit Airlines CEO Ted Christie being quite outspoken on the impact that's having, and his feeling that there's a bias towards the bigger players. Why won't you let two of the smaller players combine and offer genuine competition to those big players who are, several orders of magnitude bigger than anyone else? So I think, when you say things haven't settled yet, that is very much the case. I think particularly in Asia, which is a different story. But there are those signs, I think, in the market like the US where it sort of has. I think you can start to see, talk of overcapacity is quite something when you think where we were even just 2 years ago, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, I thought one of the most interesting stories to come out of it was Southwest Airlines, who have sort of struggled. They're obviously very hard hit by problems with the MAX and not getting aircraft on time in the way that they had anticipated. But, amongst wider challenges there, you also have Southwest, talking about possibly doing something about assigned seating, which, we were talking about building back better or differently, maybe. But that's interesting. That would actually be an absolutely fundamental change for them.
It would, yes. And it's kind of, when you think about whenever a low-cost airline starts up, or we're just talking generally about the low-cost industry, there are always these kind of benchmark carriers that people cite with their business models and what really defines them. And well, we know, I think, certainly from the UK, I think it kind of was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe certainly EasyJet and possibly even Ryanair used to operate unassigned seating. they quite a while ago, I think in pre-COVID, have kind of stopped doing it. So yeah, quite something when you're hearing about Southwest doing that. It's kind of whether it's really a true low-cost carrier anymore or not. We could probably debate that for several hours, but that's certainly, then that step towards assigned seating, I guess, is another sign of it kind of shifting maybe more towards that middle ground. But certainly in the case of Southwest as well, as you say, when I mentioned before about not having the aircraft to spread your costs over, I think that's an example there. It's probably worth mentioning, of course, that new aircraft don't necessarily increase capacity. So the other impact of all these new aircraft not coming in, particularly when you're talking about Southwest, where it's dozens fewer than you expected, they are delivering cost savings of 15-20% fuel consumption, for example. They might be upgauging. You're expecting to improve your revenue on certain routes as a result. So it's not all about expanding capacity. It's about getting in newer aircraft to make your business more efficient, achieve economies of scale, that kind of thing. And that all of these delays are affecting things there. And as you say, Southwest is a good example of that happening in the US.
Whilst we looked at sort of strong markets, people largely having a strong view of the market and even over capacity in some sectors, but people broadly very upbeat about demand on the transatlantic or to Latin America. Asia is maybe had a little bit of a backward step, and certainly China, where I think after the surprise progress of a year or so ago, where it kind of lifted the shackles of its zero tolerance approach to COVID almost overnight, things haven't quite opened up, especially to international airlines in the way that maybe had been expected.
No, and that is, multiple airlines in Asia and the Asia Pacific region have talked about this, as have carriers that connect to China and obviously from Europe and further afield. So yes, it's very much when you talk about how markets have recovered out of COVID, or at least gone back to how they were, I think perhaps the biggest thing globally that hasn't really come back is China. It's obviously a huge market. I think with the caveat that I think even pre-COVID, it perhaps wasn't the penetration, certainly into secondary Chinese airports for overseas carriers, certainly on the long haul, that they would hope for. And we saw examples of BA, for example, going to Chengdu and cutting the route fairly quickly, where things like that weren't successful. But I think the more fundamental issue is fewer people group travel out of China. I think there's still echoes of the pandemic restrictions are making people reticent to travel. We know from data that China's domestic market has come back and then some. So it's, again, like the US domestic market is absolutely huge. I think 13-14% of all global traffic is in China's domestic market, and that is, I think, at last count way 10-15-20% above pre-COVID levels. So that capacity, certainly from Chinese carriers, that isn't going international is going domestically. And broadly, I think everyone's saying it. I think tentative is the right word. These big groups of Chinese travellers, they would have been connecting to their home markets, just isn't happening. On top of that, you've got so many geopolitical tensions globally. We know the US and China, for example, that no US carriers in a rush to start connecting China at the moment. We know on top of that there's tensions around who's friends with who over with the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and there are all sorts of factors really playing into China coming back much more slowly, and that is having impacts all over the place. As I say, not just Chinese airlines. Obviously, so many of the low-cost carriers, for example, in Asia would have been flying into China, connecting those tourism markets, both outbound and inbound. We know that even Air New Zealand talking about, because carriers aren't flying as much into China or out of China, they're reassigning capacity into other markets as a result. So we know that Air New Zealand cited a particularly tough competitive environment because they're seeing more flying into their market. So that's having an impact all round, and it's still got a long way to play out, really. I mean, it's all still down on 2019, and as I said before regarding the whole industry, if you factored in the growth you would have expected without COVID, it's really a long way off. So yeah, that is weighing on things certainly for any airline that's used to connect China, but it's being felt quite acutely still for a variety of reasons in the closer region. And it's really a theme to watch, and that'll be interesting. We'll be at the IATA AGM in a few weeks, and it'll be interesting to talk to a few airline chiefs about that a bit more, I think, to find out whether there are any signs of improvement, or, indeed whether this is structural now, and, that golden era of Chinese travel where, it felt, there weren't any boundaries to this growth, whether that's a thing of the past. And of course, one other consequence of that is that I think more people are looking to India as kind of an engine of growth in the region as well.
No, absolutely. And of course, it's worth noting that this quarter also, we've seen the continued impact of challenges around Israel and services to that market being off limits. And I think, carriers are impacted to different extents. But I think it's, Israel's quite a good market, year-round market on the one hand for O&D traffic, and also there's a good kind of winter sun or late season sun element to it as well. So I think you could probably argue that it has a sort of quite a strong impact over the winter months more than anything. Now, airlines are able to kind of redeploy that capacity over the summer months, which there are far more options as to where they could put that and put that more profitably. So, and obviously they've had time to structure that in, whereas finding new routes to fly to in the winter at short notice is something of a challenge.
Yeah, it will be. And of course, I think Egypt and Jordan as well, particularly Egypt with quite a big leisure market from Europe, has, as you say, been impacted and continues to be impacted by that. I think there's been some benefit, certainly, to some of the North African leisure destinations as a result of the continued unrest in the Middle East, albeit a few airlines were quite significantly impacted. Wizz, for example, had quite a lot of capacity and needed to move at short notice at the end of last year. Ryanair, EasyJet in Europe, and that's before you start thinking about all the long haul players who were flying in there. So again, an ongoing situation, just as the situation in Ukraine obviously continues to mean that, going back to Asia again, obviously connecting Europe with Asia, for example, continues to be quite painful in terms of time and fuel consumption for airlines in Europe. And it continues to be the case that Chinese carriers can overfly Russia, so there's a sense of a competitive advantage there. So lots of ongoing challenges because of the geopolitical situation, I think, in multiple places.
Absolutely. So we've given you a whistle-stop tour across the first quarter, across regions. After the break, we're going to zone in on 2 or 3 carriers in more depth.
Hello listeners, I'm Andy Mason and I want to introduce you to Beyond Entertainment, a new podcast from Panasonic Avionics. Each week we sit down with the best and brightest in our industry for a quick chat on the future of passenger experience. Everything from display and audio technology to in-flight Wi-Fi and killer digital content to meaningful market research. We're looking at what's now, what's new and what's next. So join us as we explore the passenger experience. Go Beyond Entertainment. Available now on your favourite podcasting platforms or on our website, panasonic.aero/Beyond Entertainment.
Yeah, so welcome back to the Airline Business Podcast. As we've probably noticed, it has been a few weeks since we're a few weeks later producing this one than we would have liked. We've been pretty hectic, actually, with one thing and another, because we have a new website for Airline Business, an all singing, all dancing, dedicated website for Airline Business, which is very exciting for us, and get all our analysis and our sort of benchmarking topics and data and so forth from it. What could people expect from it?
Well, we're really excited by it. It's Airline Business, obviously, I think in its 40th year. I think this year we best known, I guess, as a printed magazine up until, it's always had a bit of a web presence, but certainly the driving force has been the magazine, and this is very much giving it the kind of online home that it deserves, and then sort of enhancing, what through the opportunities that being online bring, we've kind of really enhanced what Airline Business has become known for, to deliver something that we hope is kind of a tool that people can use for anyone who's working within or needs to know about the airline industry globally or within particular regions, there's just lots in there now for you to look at. And as you say, it's got all the content you'd expect from airline business. So the analysis of the industry, it's got our CEO interviews. But what really is the step change is we've always had data in airline business, but part of the reason I've got lots more grey hairs and less hair generally than I did probably 2 or 3 months ago is that we've put a lot of time into building a database of what we're heading towards at the moment is something like the world's 100 biggest airlines and groups, which covers finances, traffic capacity, fleet, back to 2019. I think 2019 offers a nice benchmark from which to measure the industry's progress. We've got lots of data in there, quarterly, annual, half yearly, whatever's reported. And the really powerful bit, I think, is we then combine that data and give you some aggregate overall pictures of what's going on in each region and globally as well. On top of that, we've got some other really powerful tools, I think, around a share price index where you can index any airline on our site that is publicly listed. You can index its share price against a global average and against other carriers. Got lots of nice indicators of fuel prices. We've got some of the IATA data on there, which is really good. We've got our famous world airline rankings on there. We often get lots of requests for that. Again, it's really nice for it to have a home where people can access it very easily all the time. So worth saying, subscribers also get a weekly start the week email called the Airline Business Agenda, where we set out what's coming up in the airline industry for the coming week. At the same time, telling you what happened over the past 7 days as well. So a really nice sort of start the week summary. Have I missed anything, Graham?
I think that's good. Other than, without giving too much away, we're recording this at the end of the week, and that Lewis still hasn't delivered his start the week agenda, which you'll have to do at the end of this. So it is good. Good to take a look. If you can find us at flightglobal.com/airline-business. Go and take a look. Find details of how to get a free trial to have a look around the website. So all very exciting.
Yes, and on the topic, one of the key things on the site is our coverage of earnings and heard from EasyJet. Always a bit confusing. They always catch us by surprise because they put out a kind of preliminary announcement, don't they? And then so you think it's all done, and then you wake up one morning and it's, there's an EasyJet call, right? And this time it was definitely worth being on it, wasn't it? Because there was some quite interesting news from the low-cost carrier.
Yeah, absolutely. So Johan Lundgren, who, it obviously only feels like a couple of weeks ago that he took that job as CEO.
Yeah.
I remember you interviewing him, Lewis, within like the first year or so, and not obviously we're still using the pictures from that. He doesn't appear to have changed at all or aged at all in any way, which is a great credit to him. But
I would just say I remember him saying to me they had no plans to launch a holidays business, by the way. So but there's no comment. But
yes, and holidays business is one thing that happened. But they've announced a succession plan with Lundgren stepping down. They're saying early in 2025, and he's going to be replaced by Kenton Jarvis. He's the CFO at the airline. He too came from TUI previously, but I think actually he's got quite a high profile within the airline. He speaks very well and is quite prominent in the investor presentations. And in fact, he's been involved in that strategy. In fact, I think he actually leads that strategy as part of his CFO function. And I think what's really noticeable about EasyJet and that appointment is that it is a sort of, for want of another word, Jarvis was the continuity candidate because it reflects a continuation of it. This is like a succession plan. And it's fair to say, actually, that EasyJet, for a variety of reasons over the years, hasn't gone down that route. Lundgren himself, obviously, he came from outside the company, coming from TUI. And actually, the previous two chief executives, Carolyn McCall and Andrew Harrison, both came out of industry. So, I think it says something for the consistency of EasyJet's model and their strategy. And they're really sort of clear about it. EasyJet has probably been, one of the more cautious in terms of adding capacity since the pandemic, especially among the low-cost carriers. In October, they set about an aim to reach, annual profits of at least £1 million every year. And they're sort of working towards that. That's a medium-term target towards it. And their strategy to reach that, which involves kind of, as you talked about there, Lewis, it's around that holiday business, which is an emerging and developing business, and which helps to tackle some of the seasonal parts of the losses. So actually, their holiday business was profitable during the winter months, whereas the low-cost flying business, that's only ever once made a profit in the 6 winter months. Obviously, EasyJet's first half running from October to March, so it's a particularly cruel time to be running. But so that carries a bit of a benefit. EasyJet sticking to this model of their strong positions in primary airports, particularly around places like Paris and Amsterdam and so forth, and Gatwick, of course. And this upgauging model, which they've got, which is an opportunity. They've got still a number of A319s in the fleet, and basically every time they're replacing those aircraft with not only newer technology, more efficient technology in the NEOs, but also they're either A320s or A321s. So the seat gauge is going up, and I think across the lifetime of their, the next 10 years, the average seat gauge will go up from about 180 now to more than 200. So you can see where they're going. You can see the strategic direction with it. And what's interesting, what I certainly thought was interesting was this kind of within the company that they are very much sticking to that development and that roadmap. And so, I think when Jarvis takes over in the early part of next year, I don't think you're going to see anything different from them. I think you're going to see broadly much the same.
Yeah, I remember I interviewed Jarvis when he was at TUI. He was head of airlines there. I think in late 2019 I interviewed him, and obviously Lundgren himself came from TUI, I think, as well. As you say, it's they're both people with not dissimilar, I think, backgrounds as well. More to the same. No, I was quite surprised to hear them mention getting aircraft earlier than expected, which you don't read about much, albeit I think in the next fiscal year they weren't so optimistic about getting them. But
yes, they actually think they're getting their Airbus Neos this year slightly earlier than planned, albeit next year's aircraft are slightly later than planned. But relatively speaking, I think they're in a relatively solid position on that front. Their Neos are operated with CFM engines, so they don't have the GTF issue. And whilst Airbus has all sorts of pressures around it, supply chain pressures around it, they obviously don't have the added challenges of the MAX at present. Another interesting operator, and another, possibly the most intriguing bit of news to come out over the past few weeks has been IndiGo, in the Indian airline. And when an airline has ordered 500 Airbus aircraft just a few months ago, you sort of lose track as to what they ordered. And a couple of weeks ago, news trickled out of an order for some A350s, and I was trying to think, hang on, I think that might be new, isn't it? Did they order those as part of them? And it definitely is new, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the sequence of press releases often catches you out on these things. But yeah, no, it's I think Airbus announced it about a week after IndiGo had announced it. So yeah, everyone. But like you say, with IndiGo, you never can quite be sure whether it might actually be another order, given the number of aircraft they've got coming in, which I think now is, depending how you measure it, it's definitely around 1,000 on order. But the kind of rationale for it has been talked about a lot. We know India's growth, particularly as middle classes, and the demand for travel is huge. I think what's interesting with its latest order is obviously with the caveat that when I say latest order, I think their earnings are coming up, and there have been rumours of a regional aircraft order. But at the moment, its latest order is, I think, for 30 firm A350-900s. What's obviously really interesting there is that brings them into the long haul market. Up to this point, they've got XLRs on order, I think. So they're out, probably ought to be going to 7-8 hours with them. But this is going fully long haul, I think we don't need to talk any great depth about the history of low cost long haul without very quickly coming to stories of things going quite wrong. So it's an interesting move from that point of view. I think they're so strong in India, though. I think the backbone of that kind of short haul model that at the moment is delivering some quite impressive results is presumably a really strong foundation under Peter Elba's there to start looking long haul. When they announced this order, Elba's characteristically probably cards a bit close to his chest, but he did talk about the lack of wide body capacity among Indian carriers at the moment. So I think the only ones who realistically that means is Air India and Vistara, who are obviously on the verge of becoming one airline. So I think it's 70 or so, maybe slightly less wide body jets in India. You compare that, I don't know, if you look at just one of the big carriers in China or one of the big carriers in the US, and they'll have plenty more than that on their own. So there is a strong argument, I guess, with this growing middle class in India, such a huge population underserved by local carriers. They're making the jump into long haul. I think in terms of what that product will be, Elba's talked about potentially flying them from multiple hubs, and this will be from 2027. I think they start to receive them. So perhaps in fairness to Elba's, that it would be a bit mad if they had definite plans of about where everything was going to go and willing to announce it at this point. So yeah, but in terms of the actual product, again, it's unclear whether it's going to be a kind of hybrid offering. Are they going full service for these aircraft? Is it going to be, as I said before, for a proper low cost long haul product? If Elba's to be believed, those decisions are still to be made. But yeah, obviously, what's clearly emerging, I think, in India at the moment is IndiGo alongside the new Air India, which has obviously absorbed two of the other Indian carriers, and AirAsia India and Vistara, is kind of a maturity perhaps among the big players. I think IndiGo, it's fair to say, if that's showing through most there. I mean, they're pretty impressive run of financial results, and they're looking at really, really strong growth, and they've got orders lined up now into the next decade. So, but yeah, I think in order to make a success of adding wide bodies as a carrier that's only ever been low cost, it would have to buck a couple of trends. One is that making long haul work in a low cost business in a sustainable manner, and two will be continued ability to make money in India, which again is not something that, for all its potential, has been anything but easy for any incumbents. We know that, I think, partly is because the flag carrier has been a bit of a basket case over the past decade or so. So it probably helps everyone that Tata's in place there and pulling that into shape. And it probably, won't distort the competitive environment so much. So yeah, really interesting development. So it's full of potential and warnings about how it's going to be tough to fulfill that potential. But, with Elba's in place at IndiGo, great experience from KLM operating a hub carrier there. I mean, it does start to make a bit more sense. Not that it didn't make sense why they'd appointed Elba's, but it certainly would have made his CV look a lot stronger if the board there were thinking about getting into long haul wide body operations at the moment they took him on.
Absolutely, and you're sort of seeing this sort of echoed through a little bit. Obviously, you saw Fly Dubai make a move towards 787s. It is interesting. I think that long haul, low cost model, that's the one market where it seems to have embedded a little bit more. Scooters obviously doing a fair bit. You've got the likes of Zip Air for JAL, and ANA has just launched Air Japan, and actually the likes of Jetstar have been operating quite lengthy routes, if not necessarily wide bodies. So it is interesting, but exactly as you say, IndiGo actually now, with a growing cargo business and a strong regional arm as well, increasingly from a low-cost usurper in the market, now very much resembling almost like a traditional airline group.
That's it, yeah, and I think that's almost probably what it is looking to become, isn't it? If it's not already, yeah, it's kind of, and we know, from the one of the key differences to some of the other airlines you mentioned there is obviously they are parts of groups that have grown up network carriers. So I think when you look at Norwegian, for example, we all know what happened to their long haul operations and how they've had to kind of regroup as what it was first intended to be. So an interesting one to watch. And I think on that topic as well, probably an airline that's actually got rid of two of its current generation wide-body aircraft in the low-cost sector. Maybe that's a nice segue into another carrier you've been having a close look at, which is Azul in Brazil.
Yeah, a really interesting story, this one. I mean, they're already... Latin America has been a really, really painful and difficult market to operate in post-pandemic. I mean, Azul are pretty much the last carrier not to enter some kind of formal financial restructuring. It has had to do deals with its lessors, had to work, be pretty agile to avoid that. And partly, obviously, the challenge that all the carriers in that region have faced is just not having access to the same levels of state bailouts that have been apparent elsewhere. And of course, very recently we saw Gol, an established Brazilian carrier, having to enter a formal financial restructuring. Azul is interesting. They were very positive in the first quarter. They, at an operating level, are sort of the profits are improving. Even at net level in that difficult quarter, they did manage to cut their losses, albeit with the caveat that that's before currency, which was a major impact in the first quarter in Brazil. And I thought what was really interesting is, again, it's about having faith in their model. And for Azul, they were, despite all sorts of things have gone on, but again, they're looking to that refleeting, and they're bringing in Embraer E195 E2s, a program which, and anyone who's taking Embraer aircraft at the moment is generally quite positive about life. American Airlines spoke very positive. They were the chief executive there was asked about Boeing, and actually, in amongst broadly saying what you said before about Boeing should get its act together and sort everything out, he was very proactively said, I want to give a shout out for Embraer. So Azul, had a similarly positive view about the aircraft, the partnerships they were getting there, and the aircraft. They're due to take 13 more of those aircraft in, which gives them that growth story. And why growth is so significant for them is that John Rogerson, the chief executive there, was saying, when we grow profitably. They need the growth to continue that profitability drive. So they're actually looking at at strong growth going forward for the rest of this year. They weren't able to get that in the first quarter, partly because they lost some capacity, partly because as part of that restructuring arrangements with the lessors, they returned a couple of A350s. They've got some A330s coming in around now that will replace that capacity. But getting those Embraers brings them back onto a more positive trajectory growth-wise, and they definitely see growth as integral to how they can continue to be profitable. As you bring those aircraft in, you improve the efficiency, but they're also working on increasing the fleet utilization, which would certainly help for them as well. But it was interesting hearing them talk. They view the pandemic as an interruption, but are kind of pitching things as we're back on that growth trajectory now. That will drive profits, that will drive us going forward. It was a very positive view given the consistent challenges operating in that market. Azul's also very interesting because there has been a bit of speculation about whether they'd make a bid for Gol. The executives there wouldn't be drawn on it. They sort of commented on it in bits and pieces, other than they did say, we do like consolidation, and they have demonstrated that before. I think Azul's a relative newcomer to the market. The airline David Neeleman started. They grew in size through acquiring another Brazilian carrier, Trip, at one stage. They were interested in acquiring former assets from Avianca Brazil when that collapsed. They were looking at when LATAM, which obviously has the old TAM operation from Brazil. When that went into its formal restructuring, they were looking at a potential bid there. So, it certainly would make some sense that they'd have some interest in GOL, whether they were quite sure what kind of share of the market that would give and what, how that would be viewed from a regulatory side. But you could certainly see that this is an airline which retains ambition. And I think that's quite refreshing. And I think you're seeing it not just with Azul, you see it with Avianca, which has formed the Abra group. I think you have carriers in that part of the world who are looking to find ways to get scale and to grow, to be able to effectively take advantage of the opportunities there. Yeah,
it's certainly, again, not unlike India. It's a place where you go to any event there, and the talk is, you look at per capita, how much people travel is so much lower than elsewhere. Yeah, partly because of economic reasons, but certainly, again, growing middle class, no strong rail network, etc., etc. It's kind of ripe for there to be stronger airlines there. But as you mentioned, the outside factors often get in the way there, as shown in some of the exceptionals, and certainly around currencies, you can get in the reporting there where currencies can be incredibly weak against the US dollar, for example, and when a lot of your expenditure is in US dollars, that's problematic. We know the fuel in Latin America is also a big bugbear, I think, for a lot of carriers. The taxes on that, the impact that has on costs. So, but as you say, at the same breath, there's it's nice to hear us all pushing on with that optimistic view and looking to growth. And for the Abra Group, obviously GOL is part of that, so there's it's really intriguing to see how that story develops. If Azul was interested in it, Abra is Avianca and GOL is kind of its main carriers, so that would be an interesting impact there if anything should happen around consolidation. But it's a market where there are signs of maturity alongside lots of signs of familiar challenges, and we'll be keeping a close eye on it through the rest of the year.
Absolutely. Okay, so we should probably leave it there. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you, Graham.
Our thanks again to Panasonic Avionics for sponsoring the podcast. Do give the Beyond Entertainment podcast a listen. Reminder, you can catch up on all the news and stories we mentioned in this podcast. To get them all, our best airline business content, you should now go to flightglobal.com/airline-business. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like us and review us. And don't forget to subscribe to get new episodes in your podcast feeds directly. And we'll see you again next time.